Hello everyone, this is Dr. Alex Vasquez with a brief update to Inflammation Mastery and Functional Inflammology. Subtitled Introduction to Clinical Nutrition, Functional Medicine, and Integrative Pain Management, which I'll discuss with a few more citations, for disorders of sustained inflammation. This is Volume 1 of the Inflammation Mastery series. I've published most of this work at least 3 times, so I'm calling this the 3rd edition now. And the version published as Functional Inflammology is in full color. I'll discuss the differences between these two books in just a moment. I call this a 3-part learning system because it provides text with an abundance of citations, graphic representation of much of this material in the form of my presentation slides, and then audio-video presentations and tutorials as well. So you really get to learn the material in 3 different ways. First, by reading it and looking at the citations and really getting an intellectual understanding, and then getting a more visual or perceptive understanding of the material through the slides, and then also finally putting it all together with the audio-video presentations and my tutorials with students. We are planning to have a continuing medical education presentation built upon most of this material. You can look at the website inflammationsummit.org for this information. We had initially planned to launch this in September of 2014 due to my lecturing schedule in August and also some delays with the publication of this work due to all of the extensive updates. We're probably going to push that into the latter part of October or early November, and it will also include 2 hours of pharmacy. The new book not only has colored diagrams, but it actually has a lot more diagrams. Here you can see a representation of endoplasmic reticulum stress, which some of you might know through some of my other works. I now connect with a rather important topic, which I've published widely on, that is mitochondrial dysfunction. And you'll see in the next page how these are actually tied together. So mitochondrial dysfunction and endoplasmic reticulum stress actually have many of the same causes, and they have many of the same effects, namely inflammatory imbalance and this sustained pro-inflammatory state. So in the book, I show you how to break those vicious cycles of sustained inflammation to help you treat your patients who have inflammatory disorders, which is certainly most of your patients. Some of you may have seen this picture before in its black and white version. Now you get to see it in color. And again, I think the color, photos, and images and the graphics really help to bring you through the material and maintain some enthusiasm for the material instead of just getting mired down in 700 pages of black and white text, which I'm sure we all appreciate would be pretty boring. So I hope you enjoy the new colorized version of the material. Let's look at a few differences and some updates that I do have for you here in September 2014. So initially the plan was to publish this work in 630 pages of color, and that was going to be called Inflammation Mastery. Well, the publisher I was working with made it clear to me that they couldn't do that. They could only do 630 pages in grayscale, or they could do color, but only up to 480 pages. So what I did is I went ahead and published it in grayscale at 630 pages. Then when I found a publisher who could handle more capacity, we published it in full color, and I was able to add another section on dysbiosis, my presentation slides on dysbiosis, just to make the material more complete. So originally, Inflammation Mastery at 630 pages provided 11 hours of video. Functional Inflammology, with the additional section on dysbiosis, provided 14 hours of video. And just within the past couple of weeks, I've added 6 more hours of video to both of those books. And those are presentations that I recently gave for continuing medical education on mitochondrial dysfunction. So if you want access to those new videos and you don't have the new printing of the book, just send me proof of purchase and I'll send you the hyperlinks and the passwords so that you can access those videos online. A few changes were made to the books recently, and this applies to both books. I made a few minor edits here and there, and I also added 1 additional citation on opioid deaths, which we'll look at right now, and then I also updated the section on hypothyroidism, and I'll tell you more about that in just a moment. But let's look at this article that was published in JAMA on a very impressive way to reduce opioid deaths. This was published in JAMA Internal Medicine. This is August 25th of 2014. Medical Cannabis Laws and Opioid Analgesic Overdose Mortality in the United States. So one of the things I want to point out is that opioids are very dangerous drugs, and a lot of people die from using opioids even if they're not overdosed. So the title of this article is somewhat misleading because it implies that people die if they overdose on opioids, and while that is certainly true, a large percentage of deaths from opioids occur in people who are taking the lowest possible dose. We'll look at that information in just a moment. Let's look at a quote from this article that you can see in the text box above. States with medical cannabis laws had a 25% lower mean annual opioid mortality rate compared to states without such laws. Conclusions and relevance. Medical cannabis laws are associated with significantly lower state-level opioid mortality rates. Further investigation is required to determine how medical cannabis laws may interact with policies aimed at preventing opioid deaths. So this was very widely discussed in the lay press. Let's look at a few citations there. I've obviously covered this information in the book, and I just added the additional new citation. Chapter 3 on integrative pain management has been completely updated, and let's look at an excerpt from that book. So I'm going to go ahead and read these two sections, even though it might seem a little academic or lengthy for me to do so. I think this information is important for putting the new cannabis research into perspective. So, from Pain Physician 2012 July, over the past 2 decades, past 20 years, as the prevalence of chronic pain and healthcare costs have exploded, an opioid epidemic with adverse consequences has escalated. We see a dramatic increase in opioid drug use. This is due to aggressive marketing by the pharmaceutical industry. These positions are based on unsound science and blatant misinformation, and accompanied by the dangerous assumptions that opioids are highly effective and safe and devoid of adverse effects when prescribed by physicians. You'll notice that this is a quote from the original article. This is not my opinion. This is actually a quote from peer-reviewed research. The escalating use of therapeutic opioids shows hydrocodone topping all prescriptions with 136.7 million prescriptions in 2011. This is just from the United States, with all narcotic analgesics exceeding 238 million prescriptions. It has also been illustrated that opioid analgesics are now responsible for more deaths than the number of deaths from both suicide and motor vehicle crashes or deaths from cocaine and heroin combined. The majority of opioid-induced deaths, that is 60%, so 60% of opioid-induced deaths occur in patients when they are given prescriptions based on prescribing guidelines by medical boards, with 20% of those deaths in the low-dose opioid therapy of 100 milligram morphine equivalent or less per day, and 40% in those receiving morphine over 100 milligrams per day. By comparison, 40% of deaths occur in individuals abusing drugs obtained through multiple prescriptions, doctor shopping, and drug diversion. The obstacles that must be surmounted are primarily inappropriate prescribing patterns, which are largely based on lack of knowledge, perceived safety, and inaccurate belief of undertreatment of pain. So again, this type of research, emphasizing what is now being called a crisis in pain medicine and rheumatology, in order to address this crisis in pain medicine and rheumatology, I have updated the chapter that deals with integrative pain management. Related to the new research that's published in JAMA, let's look at this other article published in a magazine called The Nation. Prescription opioids are the most dangerous drugs abused in America, with more than 16,000 deaths annually linked to opioid addiction and overdose. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention report that more Americans now die from painkillers than from heroin and cocaine combined. People in the United States, a country in which painkillers are routinely overprescribed, now consume more than 84% of the entire worldwide supply of oxycodone and almost 100% of hydrocodone opioids. In Kentucky, just to take one example, Kentucky is a state within the United States. About 1 in 14 people is misusing prescription painkillers. So we see that we as healthcare providers have an absolute need to address this public health care crisis of opioid overprescribing and opioid deaths. Therefore, the new research on medical cannabis is actually quite relevant, because if medical cannabis prescribing is associated with a 25% reduction in opioid-related deaths, that's obviously very significant. This information was covered very widely in the lay press. You can see this from August 26, 2014 in CNN. You can access this online just like I did. You can also find it in Newsweek. In states with medical cannabis laws, painkiller deaths dropped by 25%. Very nice article here, published in The Nation, which I already cited. You can also access this online. And then here's an article from the Journal of the American Board of Family Medicine reviewing the medical uses of cannabis. The only other major update, and I shouldn't even call the first update a major update. I had already reviewed medical cannabis in the book, certainly not as an advocate of it, but just letting you know what the research shows. I added the new citation to that section, but I did make some pretty significant changes or updates to the hypothyroidism section. Now, for those of you who already have the hypothyroidism section, you're not really going to miss out on anything if you don't have the newest version, which I just updated recently. Basically, the take-home message remains the same. If you want to look at that information separately, I can provide access to that via the newsletter, or you can download the digital version, which I recently published as a book called Hypothyroidism and Hashimoto's Disease in a Nutshell. On a somewhat of an aside, but I realize that many of us use Facebook as a means of either gathering information or staying in touch with friends. So I wanted to share with you a recent experience, and I'll try to keep this pretty brief, but I also think it's important for us to be aware of how our means of communication might be influenced in ways that we might not otherwise know about. So let's take a quick look at this, if you will, please. I had been in Colombia recently, and when I was at a farmer's market, I was looking at their corn. Let me go back just a little bit. So what you see in this picture is some corn from a farmer's market in Colombia, and I was looking at this corn and I noticed that it looked very different from the corn that we have in the United States, for example. And so I did a little bit of internet searching for the differences in corn between the United States and Colombia, just for the sake of curiosity, being the nutrition student that I will always be and still am. So I just wanted to see, what's the difference between corn in other countries and corn in the United States. And what I found was some really interesting political information showing that Colombian farmers had been recently forced to destroy their own crops in favor of genetically modified grains from the United States. Well, of course, that caused a lot of protests because the farmers were saying, hey, you can't ask us to destroy the grains that we've cultivated for hundreds of years and which sustain this country. That doesn't make sense. It's creating vulnerability for our livelihood because we as farmers grow these grains, and if you make us destroy our own food supply, then we're dependent on these multinational corporations based in another country, and that doesn't make sense for Colombia. So they organized and they protested and they had strikes. A lot of people were arrested and detained. 660 human rights violations were documented. 485 people were wounded in the protests and 12 people were killed. Well, I thought that was pretty shocking. We're just talking about corn and food here. A lot of this didn't make sense to me, but in the interest of public health and discussing nutrition research, and I consider this to be research because it does affect food availability, which ultimately comes down to certain human rights issues and nutritional issues and ultimately clinical issues. I think most of us in the scientific arena are very well aware of at least the controversy, if not some pretty clear evidence either for or against genetically modified foods and the related herbicides, pesticides, and other toxins associated with them. So, this is a pretty hot topic these days. So I posted this information on my Facebook page, And very interestingly, the following day, Facebook killed my advertising for a book I had just published on dysbiosis. So obviously my inflammation mastery and functional inflammology books have an entire section on dysbiosis. The functional inflammology book has the presentation slides because I was able to print more capacity. Well, I took that information and published it as a separate book called Dysbiosis in Human Disease so that people who had inflammation mastery, which didn't have the presentation slides, could kind of supplement that book with the presentation slides, and then it would be equivalent to functional inflammology. So this second book, which I just mentioned, or I should say excerpted book, Dysbiosis in Human Disease, I was advertising it on Facebook, but then when I posted some information about GMO, Facebook seems to have killed my advertising. So the paradox, for me with this was that they were still charging me for the ad, which was I was paying per click, and even though they were still charging me, I wasn't getting any clicks. I wasn't getting any quality exposure for the ad. So obviously I canceled the ad, but I was a bit surprised by that. So I couldn't find any other reason why my ad would suddenly become ineffective after it had already been successfully delivered to 63,000 people. So I just did a Google search, seeing what I might find. So I did a Google search, and you could do the same search for Facebook and Monsanto. Well, it turns out that Facebook and Monsanto are basically owned by many of the same financial interests. If you look at this, and you can look at the citation yourself, Facebook and Monsanto, the top shareholders are identical. That was also backed up on another site expressing the connection between Monsanto and Facebook. And apparently Facebook has some history in deleting information that might be unfavorable toward Monsanto. So, there I was just kind of presenting information I thought was relevant, especially from a healthcare or public health standpoint, trying to understand the politics of food. And it's no conspiracy theory. I'm just telling you what my actual experience was. My actual experience was I posted some information about GMO foods, and the next day they something changed about my advertising. It suddenly became ineffective, and I couldn't understand why that was. And I think that people in general need to know about these things. I think glyphosate is showing some very legitimate toxicity in the research that's being published. You can see here that according to this study just published in June of 2014, in America, I believe this was Mississippi, yes, pesticides in Mississippi air and rain, glyphosate and its degradation product were detected in more than 75% of air and rain samples. Well, I think that's very significant, especially when you look at research showing that glyphosate has some potentially adverse health associations or adverse health effects. So, I felt like it was unfortunate that what appeared to be happening was Facebook was kind of blocking my ability to distribute, available research and information. So we'll, as they say, as we all say at times, keep an eye on things and see how things develop. In the meanwhile, please keep an eye out for our upcoming CME event delivered through the International College of Human Nutrition and Functional Medicine. And of course, I encourage you to take a look at the book when you get a chance, and I will post some more discounts, videos, and links to updates via the newsletter, which I hope you will subscribe to via either inflammationmastery.com or functionalinflammology.com. Those websites are exactly the same. And the reason I have two websites representing the same information is because many of you know I had a different website, optimalhealthresearch.com, for many years. I think I had it for more than 10 years. And then through some changes at Yahoo, which is where I had originally purchased the website name and the hosting, they changed the terms of their agreement in such a way that I didn't agree anymore. But the irony is I couldn't access my own website unless I agreed, but the whole point is I didn't want to agree with the new terms. So for that reason, my Optimal Health Research website basically went dead, and I had to buy these new websites, inflammationmastery.com and functionalinflammology.com. Thank you much for your attention, and look forward to sharing more with you either through books and or websites and newsletters. Thank you much.